Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we respond to and discuss a subject that you've requested, questions about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast. The basis for everything we discuss on this podcast is God's revelation of himself to us. God's revelation surrounds us. His revelation of himself brings wisdom and clarity to those who lack the ability to see. It provides us with a unique spiritual light, which allows us to see things we couldn't previously, unaided by God's word and by God's Spirit. Today, we're asking how it is that God's word and Spirit guide us and reveal things to us, help us understand and see within the topic of politics. And I'm joined by Hunter and Dave, two of our pastors here. Hey, guys.
Hey, Autumn. Good to be with you. And speaking of unique spiritual light, we are talking today on the day after the Arkansas Razorbacks' first Southeastern Conference football win since 2017. And so we have what's called hope and imagination of the future that gives energy to today. So it's great to be with you.
Hunter's using that term "we" really broadly. I think we could mean the people in the room. I think that's a stretch. We could mean collectively all the Arkansas Razorbacks fans. That could be true.
That is true. And I know that you are far more enamored with your fantasy football team rather than a real football team. So for our listeners to know, they are 3-0 on the season.
Wow. I'm doing really well.
You are.
Great. All right. Moving along to politics, although we know the two are related. Football, politics. Football, turns out, is political, right?
Just like everything else.
Absolutely. It's people working together for a common goal. And in most places where football is big, it is also highly, highly political. You don't want to be on the wrong side of the football coach or the football team. And the football coach can use his cultural capital and power to introduce subjects that the rest of the population is completely uncomfortable talking about. I remember seeing a Alabama Crimson Tide commercial on racial justice that Nick Saban and his team did, and I thought Nick Saban is the only man in Alabama who can get them to talk about this subject.
How does what we're going to talk about today connect to our class on politics that we're currently going through as well?
We've received some great questions from our listeners as we've been talking about politics. And in the class, we're trying to step back and develop a big picture worldview of what is government, how do we live together as people, and how do we process issues that are political by nature, and we mean that in the macro sense. They are about working out how we live together, how we organize life, how we do justice or don't do justice as a society. So rather than just diving in and talking about every little political hot topic, we're trying to step back and create a big container in which we can have a good conversation about it.
And then we're continuing that conversation here in our weekly podcasts by answering some questions and talking to people who have some experience within politics. Today, Hunter and Dave are joining me as we take on some questions that we've received, some of which are related to the class specifically, and others that people have submitted just in general related to politics. And so we're going to go through a number of these and hear from Hunter and Dave weighing in on these questions. When we take questions in this manner, we're doing it in a question and response format. So we're listening to the question, receiving it, and then doing our best to respond to it. Not in an authoritative way that says that we have the answer, but in a way that we hope promotes more thought and discussion. So our first question today, Dave, I'm going to ask if you would respond to this question. What are indicators that you're placing your faith in conservatism or progressivism rather than in God and in God's purposes and plans?
When your level of disappointment reaches a certain intensity whenever your person fails. I think that's a huge indicator. If you despair when who it is you've put your support behind fails or doesn't live up to expectations, then it's fine to be disappointed, obviously, or else you wouldn't have supported that person. But when they do fail, and if your emotional attachment and despair as a result of that gets to a point where it impacts your hope, then I think it is appropriate to have that question. Okay, is my hope, my faith, really in God and what He's doing, or is it actually in a particular person or political agenda? And so I'd say based on your disappointment.
I love the way you answered that, because my emotional response is often an indication that my heart is off, or where my heart is. It's often the first indicator I have. So when I'm angry about something, or when I find myself really anxious about something, that's often the first sign for me that registers that like, oh, I've really desired something strongly, or maybe put so much hope in something that this is impacting me more than it should.
When would you say a response that is sort of like that maybe is angry or dissatisfied, is actually justified? Sometimes we look at something that's happening in the political arena and do feel this sort of anger towards it. Is there a time when that sort of response is justified?
I would say yes. And Scripture is clear. It says, be angry and sin not. To be angry means to have fire, it means to have passion. And that's part of the Imago Dei, is actually to have that. So to express that by itself, or in and of itself, is fine. I think it so easily, though, becomes a sinful expression, such to where a general sort of point of wisdom, and you find this in Proverbs, is actually not to give full vent to your anger, not to give full vent to your spirit, so to speak, and that whenever you let go completely, almost inevitably, the flesh, our carnality, can kind of take over, and it mutates a righteous anger into a kind of sinful, wrathful kind of thing that is that's wrong. The fruit of that will be bad too.
Mm-hmm.
We know that anger is a fitting response to injustice or evil or wrong, and so in that sense, it's good and right to be angry. I think I often notice that if I'm overly angry, or I'm giving what Dave just called full vent, the way the flesh begins to manifest is that I start imagining doomsday scenarios for the future, or doing what's called catastrophizing. So I just think we are descending into complete disorder as a society, and I'll kind of go to the worst possible place in my mind. That's usually a sign that I've crossed from righteous anger into something else.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question, as you mentioned at first, Dave, of fulfillment and hope, what you are looking to for that. A wise history teacher of mine once said that if we are looking to anything other than God for our fulfillment, and he was referencing that in light of looking to government and governmental policy and process for some sort of fulfillment through social action. If we're actually looking to that to find some sort of fulfillment, that it's misplaced, our hope is misplaced.
I would say, though, that a part of the task of loving our neighbors, with the discussion of politics and issues of justice, it hits some of our neighbors differently than others. Mm-hmm. So I have learned that while what we're saying is true, absolutely place your ultimate faith and hope in God and His purposes. Sometimes I can dismiss the disappointment that some of my neighbors have with failed policies and their disappointments in political advancements, because it impacts them at a level that it doesn't actually impact me. So I would say, of course, your faith, hope ultimately in God. But then part of neighboring well, though, is also appreciating maybe the lingering disappointment that some of my neighbors have when their politician doesn't win.
And the fact that certain people are disproportionately affected
Right.
by some policies.
Right.
So, Autumn, back to the original question, what are some indicators that you're placing your faith in conservatism or progressivism rather than in God and his purposes and his plans? I think we've identified one, which is sometimes we overreact to losing. We're overly affected when things don't go the way we want them to go. Another thing we discussed in the class, which I think is worth reiterating, is that conservatism and progressivism describe two predominant ideologies on our political spectrum. And an ideology is basically a theory or a way of looking at the world that tends to make sense out of it all, put it all into perspective, and it tells you what would be good. So it simplifies sometimes some of our thinking. So in a conservative mindset, good is found by conserving typically the traditions, the cultural resources, the insights, the history of a culture. That's conservatism. Progressivism says that good is found by continually making progress, and in the American context, that progress is particularly extending individual liberties more and more and more and more and more. So these are pretty predominant political ideologies, and they almost tell us like conservatives conserve and progressives try to keep stretching boundaries, right? So a sign that maybe these things are over functioning for us is when we can't critique our own camp. So typically conservatives are good at critiquing progressives. They say, well, look, there's some things we've got to conserve. So if we're always pushing boundaries, we're not going to conserve these cultural resources, this wisdom, this insight that's really important. And progressives are good at critiquing conservatives. They'll say, look, if we don't keep pushing boundaries, we're going to conserve injustice. So they're good at critiquing each other. What they're not great at doing is critiquing themselves. So when you find that you're a conservative who can't critique anything about conservative history or the conservative movement or any contemporary trends within conservatism, that should be a warning sign to you. And when you find that you're a political progressive, or sometimes it's called a liberal, who can't critique anything within the progressive movement, that should be a warning sign to you. And it's actually what's happening right now is that both sides are really having trouble critiquing the far extremes of their own ideologies.
So would it be fair to say that if we are attempting to do this, to look to God, to place our faith in God and his purposes and plans, that should promote in us an ability to this sort of intellectual honesty?
Absolutely, because intellectual honesty takes emotional courage. It's hard to disagree with people who you usually would call friends. It's also hard to disagree when you might have some standing in your party or in your stream tied to being in lockstep with it. So it could come with a real loss of influence. It could come put a real strain on friendships. If you're trying to be directly involved in politics, you typically don't get to the top by critiquing your own side. Mm-hmm. That's just not how the game works, right? So you have to be willing to suffer some loss. And underneath that loss that you might suffer as a result of having this prophetic voice within your own tribe, underneath that loss you might actually have to suffer is the question, can I trust God even if I suffer loss?
That actually leads into another question that we received that hints at that. What what do I do if I know I'm going to be met with a sort of resistance or disagreement? And that question is, what if you do have a conviction and would like to be persuasive? And I think what underlies that question, would like to be persuasive, is how you've broken this down for us, Hunter, in the class. And then we also talked about this in the podcast, that politics sits in these different realms: governmental politics, electoral politics. But the way in which most of us engage is what you called persuasive politics. So in this question, would like to be persuasive, I think we're calling back to that understanding that the way most of us engage or feel politics, enter our daily lives, is in this realm, persuasive politics. So what if you do have a conviction, would like to be persuasive, but remain silent out of fear that your attempt at persuasion will be met with an angry opinion?
Well, I want to first go back to what we just talked about. One of the most disarming things is someone who is critical of their own tribe and tradition, and they've done that work. So they can really be honest about the shortcomings of their own party or their own side of the political spectrum. And when they can do that, it tends to change the posture by which they engage with the other side. And that's often really, really inviting. And I'll just say I don't experience it very often. I usually know exactly where someone's coming from, and they're kind of minimizing the hard questions for their side, but they've got really hard pointed questions for the other side, and that's not a terribly inviting posture that really invites more conversation. So I think the first thing I would say is look at yourself and ask, have I really done the work to critique the legitimate shortcomings of my own side? And can I be clear on that? Strangely enough, that actually sets you up well to be persuasive in the other direction.
A way to also think about it is if you're afraid someone is going to respond with an angry opinion, as the question states, then what can you do to make someone less afraid so that their response is angry? And we actually talked about this in another Vision for Life. We did a Vision for Life series on conflict. And a way to do that is to, as best as you can, try to frame up whatever the issue is, using as many uncontested facts as possible. Now, of course, everything's contested in terms of facts, but doing the work of building a foundation where you can tell your story. So if you want to persuade someone, the first thing you do is try to build a foundation built on facts that the person you're trying to persuade will actually agree with. So, I mean, that's the first thing you do. If they don't agree with foundational facts, then whatever it is you're building on top of that will feel like an attack. It will feel like an attempt at manipulation, therefore the angry opinion in response. So you have to do the work. What are, as best as I can tell, what are the facts? And how do I state the facts to tell a story on top of that? And a part of that is inviting feedback. Hey, do I have these facts straight? Is this how you understand this issue? And when you invite feedback, you're inviting them to have some shared meaning in with the process. And then that can become a really persuasive conversation because you're inviting them into it rather than just dictating something to them that they can just accept or reject.
I think that when I thought about this from a personal perspective, I realize that when I do this, when I enter a conversation that could bring up some sort of conflict, or that very well might bring up some sort of conflict, and I find myself afraid of the answer, afraid of the nature of the answer. So an angry opinion, afraid of perhaps the emotional sort of response that I'm going to receive, not the content of the response per se, but the nature of the response, that I am being self-protective and that I have a need to ask, am I placing too much emotional stock in this conversation, in what I'm about to ask? Or if I want to actually be present in this conversation, I have to do the work to lower those defenses, to not be simply self-protective, but to be stable, grounded enough that I can listen without defense. And then that is also disarming, that I can listen and engage honestly and be willing to admit weaknesses, perhaps be willing to say, well, this is my understanding, as you mentioned, Dave, this is my understanding of this matter. Is that yours? To be willing to ask questions. But I first have to ask, am I going in already worried, already self-defensive?
Well, it's a great question. And one of the things I'll often ask myself is, what do I think I need out of this conversation that I actually don't need? And usually the answer is, I think I need them to agree with me, or I think I need to be understood. Like, you must understand me. I'm being misunderstood. And the truth is, I really don't need them to agree with me, and I really don't even need to be understood. I'll be okay even if they misunderstand me.
A question you can ask in this conversation is, am I making it safe? So often the defense mechanisms that people already have up, and in the cultural moment we're in right now, everyone has a baseline sense of anxiety. So all of our defense mechanisms are just being worn out. We all have them. So any work you can do to try to make a conversation as safe as possible doesn't mean that it's free of opinion, and it doesn't mean that it's free of emotion. We think of persuasion, often we think, or I think, if I'm going to be really persuasive, then I'm going to try and be dispassionate and purely logical. Well, there's an aspect of that that's true. There's also an aspect of it where your emotion, your passion, is itself a part of the persuasion. There's all kinds of research that suggests that if you're really passionate about what it is you believe in, that adds to the persuasiveness of it. So the goal isn't to not be passionate or to not risk emotion, being vulnerable, etc., but to do it in a way that is built on at least some kind of commonality of facts of the situation. And then you can build a case on top of that. There's a great book where we talk about resources called Crucial Conversations that is dedicated to this kind of topic. How do we have important conversations where there's a ton of emotion and difference of opinions, and on weighty matters, on issues that really matter and really count? I recommend that.
Thank you for that recommendation and for pointing that out. I think that's so important to understand, because when we do that in our smaller contexts, when we're able to engage in those conversations in this way, then we are, in a small way, being an example of what has to happen in a much larger context for our political process to even take place. Discourse is a foundational aspect of a democratic republic in which we live. And so, Hunter, I was wondering if you could explain, there's a follow-up, part B to the question we're discussing. Why is commitment to discourse essential to the political process?
Well, let's go back to what politics is all about. It asks the question, how do we live together? And how do we do life together and organize society together? So there has to be some common ground for there to be any kind of political stability. Now, there is another dimension of politics, which is it is a struggle for power between groups. So both this, how do we do life together, and struggle for power between groups, those are both happening at the same time, and we know those are happening. But if we don't have any way of discussing things to establish common ground, then what happens is the struggle for power between groups just eats the common ground politics for lunch. So I think this is important so that our politics don't devolve into just a naked power struggle, but we can actually say, what do we both want, or what do we all want together, even if we don't agree about how to get there, even if we don't agree on what it's going to look like in the end? What do we want all together, and what's our common ground? Historically, American politics have actually been pretty good at that until the last 20 years or so. There's been a lot of common ground, even with ideological difference. What we're seeing today is we're having more and more trouble having real discourse where we can establish common ground. And so the power struggle has eaten the common ground for lunch.
Interestingly, this works both ways. I said a moment ago that when we engage in discourse, including even when we invite in emotion, and what you were explaining, Dave, when we engage in discussions, crucial conversations in that manner, I said we're exemplifying in our smaller contexts this sort of discourse that needs to take place for our political processes to actually move forward. Conversely, what you're describing, Hunter, this sort of power struggle that has been displayed for us in a large scale in our political process affects us in the way we engage with one another. And so this manifests itself in both directions. And so sometimes what we see played out on a very large scale, we find trickling down again into the way we interact with each other and the fears that we may carry into conversations with someone who we know has a different viewpoint.
We often think, I've got to protect the world, or I've got to protect myself, or I've got to protect my church, or I've got to protect my family from being influenced by these other ideas. And when we get into that mindset, we are pretty much in power struggle mode. Now I have to defeat you in order to protect my turf. So just the habit of developing conversations where we can reason, where we can try to persuade each other, where we can maybe try to find some common ground, something we both want, is a great discipline for preserving the health of our society.
One matter that has continually come up in our recent sermon series, in our podcast discussions in the last couple of weeks. So when we had Blythe and Jill on, and last week when we had Dave and Renee on, is that we have to assume a posture of humility if we're going to engage in persuasive politics, and do it in a way that maintains love for one another, neighborly sort of love that seeks each other's good. And we received this question, and I'm going to ask you, Dave, to answer it. If it is true that our posture towards each other is more important than being right or proving our own point of view, how can we grow in that sort of humble posture?
I think one way to grow, and this is kind of a sort of a trick that I've learned along the way, is you actually go into a conversation with an assumption about the person who you're talking with. And the assumption is that God's Spirit is actually at work in or on them in some way. And so with that assumption, it does kind of change what you're looking for in a conversation. Mm-hmm. No longer are you looking simply to change that person necessarily, but it's more of a where can I discern where there's already momentum or agreement or a sense of welcome that already exists in that person. And as a Christian, theologically, I know that the Spirit of God that's in me is at work in that person in some way. And so my then task is actually kind of a fun task of trying to join with and trying to sense where God's already working. And then these conversations, you can actually create a kind of resonance, heart-to-heart resonance with someone where all of a sudden you feel like, oh, I think we're actually jiving together here. And if you've ever seen a tuning fork, if you get a tuning fork and you bang it, it begins to vibrate. And then if you have another tuning fork, you don't have to touch it. You just bring it next to the other fork that's vibrating, and then somehow, magically / science, I don't know how it works, the other one begins to vibrate too.
Magic and science are the same thing to you.
Yeah, they are. But that resonance, you can actually, with an understanding of how God's Spirit works, actually create an environment for that to happen relationally. And so why it's so important that you have a humble posture is it's really about how do you create an environment where God's Spirit can really speak to both of you. And so that's something to think about.
Have you put this into practice in any particular way in your own life? Are there contexts in which you have had to sort of check yourself and realize that your posture was perhaps not what it should have been?
Yes. I mean, often, sadly. But I think in terms of if I really feel offended or feel wounded in some way, feel like that I need to let the record show, clear my name, any kind of self-protective impulse that I have, usually my posture is way out of whack. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the indicator. If I feel misunderstood or a little, I don't know, jaded, then that's an indication my posture is not what Jesus is calling me into. I'm worried about my own name and my own glory and my own kingdom, not God's glory, mm-hmm. His name, His kingdom. So that's an indicator that I'm not doing that.
Hmm. There's an interesting dynamic at play there in you identifying that your desire in those moments for self-advocacy can actually put you in a posture that is not one of humility, and that relying instead on Jesus' sacrifice, his ability to exact justice, is what is necessary. That Jesus' advocacy is actually more important and what allows you to maintain that humble posture. How does that look in matters in which we actually do need to have a prophetic voice of advocacy, not for ourselves, but on someone else's behalf, in the same way that we rely on Jesus' advocacy ultimately? What does that look like for us to say, I can still maintain a humble posture and I can still point out something that is unjust?
Like apples of gold and settings of silver, so is a word that is fitly spoken. So how you do it is, yes, you have the truth. You have the conviction of the truth, something you need to communicate. But you communicate it in a way that is fit for the situation. So you don't disregard environment context, but you utilize environment context so that at the right time you communicate it well. So it's the difference between a scalpel used in the hands of a skillful surgeon and someone who's just wielding a machete. Both are sharp. One kills, the other one heals.
Thanks, Dave. What you said there about humility actually partially answers another question that we received. And this question says, should we pray for leaders who we don't support? I'll just go ahead and take that question and answer it. I think yes, we should pray for our leaders, our political leaders, even those with whom we don't align, even those who we don't support. And I am reading into this question a little bit, but I anticipate that there's perhaps a lingering question in the mind of the person who asked this that goes something like, well, if this character's actions are egregious or hurtful towards certain people, then how can I pray for them? Is my prayer for them an excuse of a certain action, policy, position, or behavior on their part? And what I would say to that, even though I'm stretching this question a little bit, what I would say to that is that in the exercise of becoming humble listeners and doers, that when we choose to pray for someone, particularly someone who we don't agree with or align with, in praying for them, we have to acknowledge their humanity. And so instead of defining them by the things about them or about their position with which we disagree, we look at their humanity, at how they are, that person still is an image bearer, even though that image may be cracked or sometimes difficult to perceive. We recognize that they are still an image bearer of God, and in their humanity, that they also have a need for repentance and redemption and restoration. And so our prayer for them allows us to enter into this space in which we acknowledge that about our leaders, particularly those with whom we disagree. And in that exercise, what happens is our hearts are actually transformed. In the acknowledgement of their humanity, we recognize that we too are cracked image bearers, that we too are in need of the same sort of transformative grace, forgiveness, restoration. And then our hearts are transformed. So in the practice of praying for people who we find ourselves at odds with, we may find that the greatest benefit is actually our own ability to recognize what is in our own hearts and engage in this process with the Holy Spirit.
I think that's exactly what Jesus envisioned when he told us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The very next line is, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. He is actually there more interested in the transformation of his disciples than he is in whatever the outcome of the prayer is. The whole emphasis there is, this is good for you. This is going to conform you to the image of your Father in heaven.
We're going to take a hard shift now into our final question for today's episode. This one is directly related to the Vision for Life class. The audio for the class is also available on the podcast feed. And so if you want to go back and listen to that episode to hear what, or that class rather, to hear what I'm referring to here, you can certainly do that. I'm going to direct this question to you, Hunter. You used the term voting as a strategy, but many people I speak with use only the language of sin and righteousness or right and wrong when discussing matters of policy or elected officials. The latter approach makes voting a matter not of strategy, but of morality. How can I bridge that difference in understanding?
I think the quick answer is that voting is both an issue of morality and strategy. Now, let's define what we mean by those two terms. Morality is just a way of saying that when we're talking about public policy, we're usually asking questions of what is right or what is wrong, what is good, what is better, what is best, what is just, what is unjust. These are questions that sit in the moral realm. Now, when we shift into strategy, we say we've identified a policy or an approach that we would like to see implemented. What's the best way to go about getting that implemented? How do we go about solving this? And we're not just left with solutions in the realm of what we've called electoral politics. We're also can have solutions that are outside the realm of electoral politics. Like we can just try to persuade our neighbors that we need to, as a society, decide to go in a different direction without ever doing anything in the governmental or the electoral realm. I can just think of, to take a pretty non-controversial example now, I could think of like when we basically decided as a society that smoking is not good for public health, there were a few things that were happening in the realm of governmental politics to regulate tobacco and that kind of thing. But then there was a lot happening just in the realm of persuading each other, like this is ultimately not good for us. So when we're asking questions of strategy, we're asking, how do we go about seeing change? What's the best way to go about it? So I'm just acknowledging that a vote has dimensions of both of those to it. There are the candidates and the policies that they are promising to enact or to advocate for, and we typically are processing that in the moral realm. But there's also strategic questions like, is this candidate actually going to do what they say they're going to do? How are they weighting these things? They have a whole list of things they say they're going to do and not do. Well, we know they're probably going to be more intentional for some of those than others of those. So then we're weighing, if we vote for them, are they really going to do what we want to do? Those are strategic questions, not just moral questions. Is this the person we want representing us on this issue? That's a strategic question as much as it is a moral question. So both of those are involved when we're deciding how to vote.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up with that question today. Dave, Hunter, thank you for joining me and for responding to the questions that we received. If you would like to submit a question for us to discuss in an upcoming podcast episode, you can email that to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org if you'd like to send them in via email, or text it in by sending the word podcast to 94000. Thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, and to our producer, Jesse Cowan.
This is a great time for me to remind you that Vision for Life is a ministry of Fellowship Denver that exists in two forms. One form is this podcast, and the second form is a series of seminars where we discuss difficult topics that pertain to where we live everyday life. And I'm telling you that because right now we are in the middle of a series on politics. And all I have to say is politics, and you know why that is both difficult and why it's essential to where we are living right now. And so we're asking, how does the gospel of Jesus change and transform how we engage the political environment we're in? Those seminars are happening on Monday nights at 8 p.m. through October 12th. We would love for you to join us, and you can register for those at fellowshipdenver.org.